All right, so how predictors relate to criterion dimensions? Well, personality variables tend to predict contextual performance, and especially things like conscientiousness, right? That was one of the last ones I talked about in the last video. Conscientiousness tends to predict civic virtue. But other personality variables such as extroversion, neuroticism have shown contributions to contextual performance. Cognitive ability variables tend to predict task performance. So when I mentioned in a previous chapter that administering a cognitive ability test can be a really good predictor of later job performance, it really ties into literally being able to complete the tasks of the job. It won't give you any insight into these contextual things and whether this person will support their neighbor or other things. It doesn't give you any insight into that. It only gives you insight into whether this person can probably learn this task. That's basically what cognitive does for us. So let's talk about selection utility. Any organization that hires an industrial psychologist to come and develop a selection battery or tool is going to want to see that this is going to be useful. So utility is another word for usefulness. So the degree to which a selection device improves the quality of a personnel system above and beyond what would have occurred had the instrument not been used. Okay, so think about that. The organization's already chugging along. Maybe they're not super happy with the level of chugging that they're doing. Maybe they're concerned about, maybe not being able to attract the right kinds of applicants or not being able to retain good applicants, something like that. Maybe they're hiring people and then they're not performing the job as well as they would hope. But they're kind of plugging along, keeping their head above water, I like to call it. So if they were to turn to an industrial psychologist and say, can you create a selection tool? What they're really asking is, can you make this better? Can you improve this over what we're already doing? And it needs to be worth the investment that we're making, right? So selection works best when you have a lot of job openings. That's a really nice circumstance to be in, because then you have more people applying. Usually when they see that there are lots of jobs, they'll apply, and then you can kind of place people in the position where they best match. Really good when you have more applicants than openings. Then you get to pick from who has applied rather than just having to get someone, right? And then, of course, here's where the industrial side, and I have to say, I was going to say this is where the industrial psychologist comes in, is on the making a valid test. But I actually want to point out that having more applicants than openings is something that also industrial psychologists can help with, because they can help with recruiting, right? How to get this message out to the very people who would be a good fit. So I think the last two are really where industrial psychologists can shine. But what we're talking about right now is developing a valid test. And then, of course, something that IO psychologists don't really have a lot of control over, but if the salary is going to be high, you tend to get more applicants. I just saw an interview with Adam Grant, who is an organizational psychologist, and he was talking about organizations need to remember that, the reimbursement package is one of the key factors in whether a person will apply or not. It isn't necessarily the defining factor in whether they will accept the job, because a lot of times during the application process, you find out exactly what this job entails. And it may not be worth any amount of money for you to do this job or something. But most people will not apply unless they believe that if they were to get the job, it would fit their rubric of how much they should be being paid. And so having a good salary is a really important factor. The other thing, now this one might sound weird, but selection works best when it's a job that is not easily performed or easily trained. But think about it. If it's something that I could easily train anyone to do, it's something that anyone really could perform this job with just a little bit of training. Does it really matter if you make a mistake in the selection? You probably could train anyone. So selection is a really important question when you need your applicants to come in with some skills already. You need them to be able to come in with something And then what you're going to train them is like, this is how our organization does this, right? These are the rules here. These are the clients we have, or whatever it is. So if it's not an easily trained or performed task, then we definitely want to select people who already have that basic, level of knowledge. So some common utility methods. The Taylor-Russell tables estimate the percentage of future employees that will be successful in the job, and they use validity to assess that, base rate of that skill in the population, and then also selection ratio to determine validity. If you recall, base rate is the number of successful employees divided by the number of total employees. So if we look out into our current, incumbents, and we see that I would say 80% of them are what we would call performing the job the way that we would want it to be performed, that becomes our base rate. That probably 80% of our applicants could really do this job, right? Something like that. So the Taylor-Russell tables are like numbers that help us to figure out how helpful, how useful the utility of a battery given these factors. Just to remind you here, selection ratio is the number of hired people divided by the number of total applicants for the job. Okay, so the proportion of correct decisions is another utility method, which is where you look at the number of correct rejections, so the number of applicants that we didn't hire and who didn't have the skills, plus the number of correct acceptances, so those are the people who we hired who did have the correct skills, and then we divide that by the total number of employees. So it's this that we were talking about in a previous chapter, this basic thing. So what we're trying to do is do the correct rejections plus the correct acceptances divided by the total number of employees, and this gives us a proportion of correct decisions. The tough one to measure there is the correct rejections, right? Because we didn't hire the person. So there's going to be sort of a little bit of estimating that goes into that correct rejections column to figure out, okay, well, we didn't hire them because they didn't have these things on their resume, so it must have been a good decision, kind of thing. The Brogden-Cronbach-Gleiser model. I like the teamwork. I also like that they all had hard to pronounce last names. Estimates the amount of money an organization would save if it used the test to select employees. Now, one of the things that's going to be really important across the rest of this quarter is the notion that every time you have a new hire, it actually costs the organization money because that new hire needs to be trained. There'll be a period of time where they are less productive than an incumbent would have been. And so it costs money to hire somebody. So it's much more cost effective to make good decisions on the front, hire people who then end up staying with the organization for some amount of time. Longer is better. And so, so what this model does is it estimates how much money you would actually save if you would just use a good selection battery. If you use this test to select your employees, you will make fewer of these costly mistakes. All right, now this all should be in the back of your mind, making you wonder about test fairness. Some threats to test fairness would be things like measurement bias. So sometimes the way that the test is designed or appears, or that the person has to interact with it, you can end up with people giving answers that are not the desirable answers from the company's perspective, but it's not because that's what the person actually thinks, feels, or knows. It's because the way that the test is like created and designed and they have to interact with it, maybe they're making some mistakes. And so if there are group differences in test scores based on some consistent grouping, like race or gender or something like that, that are unrelated to the construct being measured, like for example, integrity shouldn't have any correlation with really any group except for people who tend to steal or don't tend to steal, or tend to lie and don't tend to lie. It shouldn't be based on sex or race or any other of the protected classes at all. But you're seeing one group is scoring differently on this than everybody else is. You might think, I think it might be the test or the way we're delivering the test. Maybe some groups are not doing these tests as accurately on their phone using their finger to tap. And so maybe it's biased towards men because their fingers are bigger on average. something like that. That's what we're talking about with measurement bias. Predictive bias is when a test is fair if people have an equal probability of success on a job, have an equal chance of being hired, right? So if this test is fair, those people who are in fact going to do well on the job are the ones who in fact do well on this test, and therefore are the ones who end up getting hired. Like, that's a fair test. If, on the other hand, you have a test that people who are likely to be good at the job and people who are unlikely to be good on the job are kind of scoring the same, or it's kind of all over the place and not a very good, valid test, the prediction is biased in some fashion. And if it's systematically biased, that's the worst situation, is if it's systematically biased. It's picking out some people and saying that they are not going to be good on the job, and other people are being picked out because of some other incidental characteristic that they have and being said they're going to be good at the job. That would be a biased prediction. So what we want is everybody who is qualified for the job to be equally likely to be recommended by this test for the job. So those are some threats to fairness. And of course, psychologists have been working on these issues for 100 years. Like, they're trying really hard to get tests to be, free of measurement and predictive bias. Like, that's the goal. I can't completely say it's perfect. Let's say that you have 60 applicants for the job. 40 of them are male and 20 of them are female. And you hired 24 people. 20 of them were male and 4 of them were female. So the selection ratio for the males was 0.5 and the selection ratio for the females was 0.2. So half as many females were being selected proportionately than the males were, right? This is what we would call adverse impact. And if we had some kind of test that was producing advice that tells the test administrator, this is the hiring decision you should be making, the test would be contributing to adverse impact. So if an organization were to implement a test, see this kind of thing happening, they don't start hiring. They say, hey, people we hired to make us a selection battery, we need you to work on this because it appears to be biased. It's your battery is recommending that we're hiring at incorrect proportions. So hopefully, I didn't edit this one very well because by the end of this chapter, you should be able to, now that you've completed all this, you should be able to understand how to determine the utility of a selection test, not mathematically, but in concept. You should be able to evaluate a test for potential legal problems. We went over all those biases. And you should be able to understand how to use test scores to make personnel selection decisions. Let the numbers guide you rather than subjective decisions, and make sure that if the numbers are telling you to do something biased, go back and look at it again and ask for new tests. All right, well, I hope that wrapped up what I covered, what I thought was the most interesting parts of this chapter. And of course, the rest of it is in the book. And I will see you in the next chapter.